A retired surgeon left her medical bag on a bus in Montreal. Inside it, $6,800 in cash, a phone with 11 years of patient records, and a letter she had never sent to her son. She didn't call transit. She didn't file a report. She didn't even realize it was gone until the next morning. But the bus driver, making 1940s an hour, found it wedged under the back seat at the end of his shift. He didn't keep the money. He didn't hand it to Lost and Found and clock out. He got in his car and drove across the city through a February snowstorm to find her. And what happened when that bag changed hands would surface a truth that neither of them had been carrying alone. Vivienne Osi-Mensah was 62 years old and had spent 34 of those years doing something most people couldn't stomach before breakfast. Cardiac surgery, open chest, stopped heart, the kind of work that required your hands to be steadier than your emotions and your mind to be quieter than the room. She had performed over 4,000 procedures at the Montreal General Hospital. She had been profiled in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. She had shaken hands with the Governor General at a dinner she could not remember a single detail of, except that the salmon was overcooked. She did not start with any of that. Vivienne grew up in Côte-de-Neige, the third child of a Ghanaian father who drove a taxi 6 nights a week, and a Haitian mother who cleaned offices downtown until her knees gave out at 53. The apartment on Barclay Street had 4 rooms and 6 people. The walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors argue in 3 languages. Her parents gave her what they had: a library card, a rule about homework before dinner, and the unspoken understanding that she was going somewhere they hadn't been, and that this was not abandonment but architecture. They were building her a road. By 16, she was tutoring chemistry to classmates who had better textbooks. By 22, she was in medical school on scholarship and sheer refusal to stop. By 30, she had completed her residency, her fellowship, her first solo surgery. By 40, she had a reputation that preceded her into rooms she hadn't entered yet. She also had a son. Xavier Osi-Mensah was 31 years old and lived in Vancouver, where he worked as a high school music teacher and had not spoken to his mother in 14 months. Their last real conversation had happened over the phone on a Sunday afternoon when Vivienne had missed his wedding rehearsal dinner because she had been in surgery. Not an emergency, a scheduled procedure she had prioritized. She had called from the scrub room, still in her gown, and said the words she always said. "I'll explain later. You know how this is." Xavier did not say much in response. He didn't need to. Silence from your child is its own kind of sentence. She had attended the wedding. She had sat in the front pew in a gray dress and watched her son marry a woman named Claudette, and smiled the whole time in the tight, controlled way she had learned to smile in the years, when smiling was not something she had the energy to mean. She left the reception early. She told herself it was because she had rounds in the morning. She knew it wasn't. The letter had been sitting in her medical bag for 6 weeks. She had written it on a Tuesday night at her kitchen table with a glass of wine she hadn't touched and a draft that had taken 11 tries. 4 pages, front and back, handwritten on the good paper her mother had given her the Christmas before she died. She hadn't mailed it. She hadn't decided not to. She had just kept carrying it, the way you carry something heavy once you've holding it long enough that you've forgotten what it would feel like to put it down. On the evening of February 9th, Vivienne was taking the bus home from a lecture she had given at McGill. She was tired in the specific way that comes not from work but from performing competence for 3 hours in front of 200 people who expect you to be more than you feel. She had her coat, her scarf, her bag. She had taken the 80 bus east, changed at Park Avenue, sat near the back, closed her eyes for what she told herself was 30 seconds. She fell asleep. She woke up at her stop, stood quickly, stepped off the bus into a wall of cold air, and walked 2 blocks to her building before her hand went to her shoulder and found nothing there. She stood on the sidewalk in the dark. February in Montreal is not a gentle thing. The wind comes off the mountain like it has somewhere better to be and resents the delay. She stood there with the cold pressing against her face and understood, with the clarity that only loss produces, exactly what she had left on that bus. The $6,800 was a payment she had withdrawn to give to her sister, who was refinancing a house and needed a cash deposit by the end of the week. The phone she could replace, though 11 years of records would take months of work to reconstruct. The letter she could rewrite. But the letter she could not rewrite. Not that one. Not what she had finally managed to say, on 11 attempts on good paper with untouched wine. That version of herself had taken 14 months and a lot of quiet nights to locate. She was not sure she could find her way back to it. His name was Martin Beaupré-Tron, and he had been driving the 80 bus for 7 years. He was 44 years old, Vietnamese Canadian, born in Brossard to parents who had arrived in Quebec in 1981 with government-assisted refugee status, 3 suitcases, and a French phrasebook they had studied on the boat. His father had worked in a textile plant in St. Henri for 22 years. His mother had done piecework at home, sewing labels into uniforms, and had sent Martin and his younger sister to Catholic school because she believed, with the ferocity of someone who had survived something, that education was the one thing no one could take back from you. Martin had believed it too for a while. He had started a business degree at UQAM at 20. Dropped out at 22 when his father's health declined and someone needed to cover the rent. He had told himself it was temporary. He had told himself that for about 7 years before he stopped telling himself anything and just went to work. He liked his job. This was not something he said to people, because people tended to find it either sad or suspicious, but it was true. He liked the rhythm of the route, the regularity of it, the faces that boarded and departed with the predictability of tides. He liked knowing that his job moved people, literally, that someone got somewhere because he showed up. There was a dignity in that which he had stopped needing other people to recognize. He had 2 daughters, Camille, 16, who wanted to be an environmental lawyer and had more confidence than Martin had possessed at any point in his life, and Jade, 12, who was quieter and funnier, and had recently decided she wanted to learn to cook traditional Vietnamese food, which had made his mother cry in the happiest possible way. His wife, Natalie, worked as an educational assistant at a primary school in Rosemont. Together they made enough for the apartment, the girls' activities, the occasional weekend at her parents' place in Lanaudière. They were not comfortable in the way that means excess. They were comfortable in the way that means the math works out if nobody gets sick. His oldest daughter, Camille, had just been accepted to Université de Montréal for the fall. Law program. Pre-admission. They had celebrated with a dinner at a restaurant that cost more than Martin's weekly grocery budget, and it had been without question worth every cent. But the tuition conversation was coming, the residence conversation, the laptop conversation. The 1,000 small financial negotiations that follow the large good news. Martin drove the last section of his route that night with 8 passengers and the low hum of a bus that had another 4 years of life in it, maybe 5 if the mechanics kept being kind. He reached the terminus at Pi IX at 10:47 p.m. He shut down the systems, stood, stretched his back, and walked the aisle the way he always did, checking for bags, umbrellas, the occasional sleeping passenger. At the second-to-last row on the right side he found it. A black leather medical bag, the kind with the brass clasp and the structured sides. He picked it up, heavier than he expected. He set it on the seat across from him and opened it. A stethoscope, 2 prescription pads, a hospital ID badge for the Montreal General, Dr. Vivian Osi-Mensah, cardiac surgery. A phone in a plain black case, a brown envelope, sealed, with Brigitte written in ink on the front, and beneath the envelope, a cash bundle held with an elastic band, which he counted once and then again because the first count didn't seem right. $6,800, in 50s and hundreds, neat and dry. Martin sat with the bag in his lap for a long time. The terminus was quiet. The maintenance crew hadn't come yet. Outside, the snow was starting, the kind that begins as nothing and becomes everything while you're not watching. $6,800 was more than 3 months of his take-home pay. It was Camille's first semester of university expenses, with something left over. It was the dental work Natalie had been postponing for 18 months. It was the transmission his mechanic had told him he'd need to replace before spring, the repair that sat in his mind the way all deferred necessities sit, like a low noise you stop hearing because you cannot afford to. There were no cameras on the terminus platform. The bag had been found at the end of shift after the last passenger had gone. The doctor, whoever she was, had no way of knowing which bus she'd been on or which driver. The transit authorities' lost and found process was slow. Items were held for 30 days, then catalogued, then released to disposal if unclaimed. The phone might be traced. The bag almost certainly wouldn't. Martin held the cash in his hands and thought about Camille, who wanted to argue cases in front of judges, who had stood in front of him at 14 and said, "Papa, I think fairness is the most important thing in the world." He thought about what it would cost to be the man who agreed with her. He thought about his mother, who had sewn labels into uniforms in a one-bedroom apartment and told him, in Vietnamese and in French, in every way she knew how, "You will carry what I gave you, or you will carry nothing worth having." He put the cash back in the envelope, zipped the bag closed, and went to find the number for the Montreal General's main line. It was after 11. No one answered in cardiac surgery. He left a message with the general switchboard and his personal cell number, and explained what he had found. He did not mention the amount of cash. He mentioned the name on the badge. Then he sat in his car in the terminus parking lot and did the math. The Montreal General was 11 kilometers away. In this snow, 25 minutes. He had to be back at the depot for 6 a.m. He had not eaten since his break at 7:30. His back was doing the thing it did in February, which was complain at a low and persistent volume that he'd learned to negotiate with rather than fix. He started the car and drove west through the snow. The hospital lobby at midnight is a specific kind of quiet, not peaceful, the quiet of things held in suspension. Martin walked to the information desk, explained the situation to the security guard, who looked at him with the careful patience of someone who had seen stranger things at this hour, and asked if there was any way to reach Dr. O.C. Mensah. The guard made a call, then another. Then he pointed Martin toward a waiting area with orange plastic chairs and a coffee machine that charged $2 for something that approximated coffee in the way that a photograph approximates a person. Martin sat down. He put the bag on the seat beside him. He checked his phone and found a text from Natalie. "Vous êtes où?" He typed back. "Long story. Home by 2. Everything okay?" She sent a thumbs up and then a question mark and then a snowflake emoji, which he understood completely. He waited. The minutes passed the way they do in hospitals, which is to say, unevenly. Some stretched, some disappeared. A man came through the lobby with a child asleep on his shoulder. A nurse walked past 3 times in the same direction. The coffee machine made a sound like a small argument with itself. At 12:47 a.m., the elevator doors opened. Vivienne O.C. Mensah stepped into the lobby. She had not changed from her lecture clothes. She was still in the gray blazer and dark trousers, her coat thrown over her arm, her face carrying the particular expression of a person who has been bracing for loss and has not yet understood that they are not going to have to. She saw Martin before he stood. He was 44 years old in a transit authority jacket, with the name Martin embroidered on the chest. He had dark circles under his eyes, and a thermos he hadn't opened, and her bag on the seat beside him, like he'd been keeping it company. She walked toward him, and he stood. He held out the bag. She took it, looked at it, set it on the orange chair, and opened it. Everything was there: the stethoscope, the pads, the badge, the phone, the envelope for her sister, the letter. She checked the cash last, all of it. She closed the bag and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. The words came out smaller than she intended. Not because she didn't mean them, because she meant them more than she had words for at 12:47 in the morning in a hospital lobby in February. "No problem," Martin said. I didn't want it sitting in lost and found for a month." She reached into her coat pocket. She kept a habit, old and unthinking, of carrying a folded envelope of cash for emergencies. She pulled it out and held it toward him. $300. Martin looked at the money. He didn't take it. "I'm fine," he said. Vivian kept her hand extended. "Please. The cash in the bag alone." "I know what was in the bag," Martin said quietly. "I counted it. I won't pretend I didn't think about it." He paused. Not with embarrassment, with the directness of someone who has decided to be honest as a policy. "But it wasn't mine, so." Vivian lowered her hand. She looked at him carefully for the first time since she'd walked in. "Why did you drive here?" she asked. "You could have left it with the transit authority, or the hospital switchboard." Martin picked up his thermos. "The switchboard closes at 11. Transit Lost and Found opens at 9. That's 8 hours before anyone would know you were looking." He shrugged slightly. "The snow was supposed to get worse overnight. I thought, better to come now." Vivian stood in the lobby with her bag in her hand and looked at a man who had driven across a city in a February snowstorm, after a full shift to return something that could have paid for his daughter's first year of university. She knew about the daughter because she had asked, while they waited for the security guard to get off the phone, and Martin had answered with the particular mix of pride and worry that parents learn to carry in equal measure. She was a woman who had spent 34 years studying the human heart, its structure and its failures, its chambers and its rhythms. And she stood there in that lobby thinking that all of it, the medical school, the 4,000 surgeries, the journals and the dinners, and the Governor General's overcooked salmon, had not taught her what she was looking at right now. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Martin nodded. "Your daughter, the one going to university, what does she want to study?" "Law," he said, and the word came out like something he was proud to be carrying. Vivian nodded slowly. "My hospital has a partnership with U2M. There's a bursary program for first-generation post-secondary students. It's not widely advertised." She looked at him steadily. "If you'll let me look into it, I can send you the information. No strings. Just, it exists, and most people who need it don't hear about it." Martin was quiet for a moment. "That's not why I brought the bag back," he said. "I know," Vivian said. "That's why I'm telling you." She drove home through the snow with her bag on the passenger seat. The streets were quieter now. The kind of quiet that only Montreal in February at 2 in the morning produces, which is to say, almost silent, which is to say, loud enough to hear yourself think. She thought about a letter she had been carrying for 6 weeks. She thought about her son in Vancouver, who had probably gone to bed by now, who would wake up tomorrow and make coffee and go to school and stand in front of teenagers who needed someone to show them how music worked, and who had learned, somewhere along the way, not to need his mother to show up. That had been her failure. Not the 4,000 surgeries, not the missed rehearsal dinner. The surgery was the symptom. The failure was the belief, held for 30 years, that loving someone from a distance was the same as loving them close. That presence was optional if your absence was serving something larger. She had told herself she was building something. She had been, but she had been so focused on the structure that she had not noticed what was left out of the rooms. The next morning she sat at the same kitchen table with the same good paper, and she wrote another letter, not a revision, a new one, shorter, no drafts. She mailed it before she could change her mind. 3 weeks later, Xavier O.C. Mensah called her on a Sunday afternoon. She was in the kitchen making rice jollof, her mother's recipe, the version she only made on days when she was missing something she couldn't name. She answered on the second ring. "I got your letter," he said. She stopped stirring. "I read it twice," he said. Then Claudette read it. He paused. She said, "You sound like you mean it this time." "I do," Vivian said. It was the shortest and most accurate thing she'd said to him in years. They talked for 40 minutes. Not about medicine, not about the wedding, about small things, his students. A piece of music one of them had written. A bakery near his apartment in Vancouver that made the same kind of coconut bread her mother used to buy on Jean Talon. He told her they were thinking about coming to Montreal in the spring. She told him she would clear her schedule. Then he said something she had not expected. "Mom, what made you finally write it?" She thought about a bus terminus in a snowstorm, a man in a transit jacket with someone else's bag, a counter on the seat beside him, a city that kept moving at midnight. "Someone reminded me," she said, "that you can't keep carrying something indefinitely and call it intent." In Canada, approximately 38% of lost items turned in to public transit authorities contain more than $200 in cash. Of those, fewer than half are ever claimed by their original owner. The return rate for found cash exceeding a week's wages, according to honesty studies conducted across 12 countries, drops below 22%. Transit workers handle found property at a rate that most passengers never think about, and most do so without recognition, without incentive, and without the benefit of anyone watching. Martin Beaupretran drove the 80 bus for another 8 years before moving to a training and safety coordination position with the STM. Camille received the bursary Vivienne had mentioned. She started her law degree in September. In her first year, she wrote an essay on restorative justice that her professor submitted to an undergraduate legal journal. It was published in March, under a title that was her own. Vivian O.C. Mensah retired from active surgery at 65, 2 years after that February. She still taught at McGill. She and Xavier had dinner when he came to Montreal in April, the spring he'd promised, at a restaurant she chose because it was close to the hospital and he hadn't been back to that neighborhood since he was a child. He ordered the salmon. She did too. It was not overcooked. She kept the letter. The second one, the one she had mailed. Xavier gave it back to her at that dinner, folded into an envelope he had resealed. "I thought you might want it," he said, "in case you forget what you sound like when you're being honest." She put it in her coat pocket. Later, she put it in her bag. Not the medical bag, a different one, smaller, the one she carried every day. She kept it there for a long time. "I keep thinking about the $22 Martin spent on gas in the original story, and the $0 it cost him in this one to simply drive across the city instead of clocking out and going home. That gap between what something costs and what it's worth is the thing I can't stop turning over." Martin didn't return that bag because it was convenient. He returned it because somewhere between counting $600 to $800 in a quiet terminus and starting his car in a snowstorm, he made a choice about what kind of person he was going to be when nobody was keeping score. That's not a small thing. That's actually the whole thing. Most of us only discover our own character in moments exactly like that, alone, tired, holding something that could solve 3 problems at once, with a perfectly reasonable exit available. What we do in that moment is not random. It's the result of everything we were taught and everything we chose to carry forward from it. His mother sewed labels into uniforms in a one-bedroom apartment. She sent him to school. She told him, in 2 languages, that what you carry is what you become. He carried it, and when it mattered, it showed. I think about Vivienne too, because her part of the story is harder to talk about. She built something extraordinary. 4,000 surgeries, a career that genuinely saved lives. And she was still carrying a letter she couldn't mail for 6 weeks because she didn't know how to be honest with the one person she most needed to reach. All that intelligence, all that discipline, and the thing she couldn't figure out was how to say "I'm sorry" to her son. What Martin did that night didn't just return a bag. It returned something to her, some proof that ordinary people do the right thing without needing a reason beyond the right thing itself. And I think that proof is what finally gave her the courage to mail the letter. Not because of any transaction, because of what it reminded her was still possible between people. There's a kind of wisdom that doesn't come from knowing more. It comes from being willing to be wrong about what you thought you knew. Vivienne had built her whole professional life on precision, on certainty, on the idea that if you trained hard enough and worked long enough, you could control outcomes. And then a bus driver with dark circles under his eyes and an untouched thermos sat in an orange plastic chair at midnight and quietly disproved everything she'd been telling herself about why it was okay to keep people at a distance. You can't separate those 3 things: doing what's right, thinking clearly about why it matters, and having the backbone to follow through when it costs you something. Martin had all 3. Vivienne had 2 of them for 34 years, and the 3rd one waiting in an envelope she kept postponing. The story only moves because both of them eventually showed up fully. I grew up watching people do quiet, unremarkable, decent things that nobody ever wrote about. That's most of what a good life looks like, up close. Not dramatic. Just consistent. Just the accumulation of small choices made correctly when the easier choice was right there. That's what I want to remember from this one.